Hello, hello. Thank you everybody for being here today. Today we're lucky enough to get to speak with Bo Huffman, the author of probably the coziest fantasy story of all time, Desserts and Dragons. And yeah, I don't even know where to begin with this. I'm gonna start with your cover letter because you wrote me a cover letter when you sent in a submission, and it was, hey, all fantasy stories are about violence and romance. This one is a bake-off, a very cozy bake-off. And I was intrigued from the get-go. And I think you did it such a positive service in terms of just creating this world that you can get absolutely lost in and not have it be any sort of it was just so wholesome and positive the entire time. And I think it's hard to find a story that just like has a slow trending up, like a slowly upwards trending plot line where even the nefarious moments don't feel, it doesn't feel existential. It was just really cozy, and I'm really grateful for that. I think we all have a time and a place where a story like this fits perfectly. So yeah, hats off to you.
Thank you.
So I've got so much written about this book, but I wanted to start. I was swithering whether or not to start with talking about Bake Off literally or talking about Dungeons and Dragons, but I want to start with Dungeons and Dragons because I know that this story was born out of a D&D story, right?
It was, and we actually just had a game last night, so I'm in the zone still.
Are you still playing Gregor?
No, we. My husband keeps wanting to write a story where we bring him back, and there was like a cute little storyline where we had talking horses named Applejack and Butterscotch, and he's like, no, we're playing with the guys. Like, we have to kill some people in this campaign.
So I'm a huge D&D nerd, and the first thing I wanted to ask was just tell me about your D&D experience and how much of the game and your experience playing it went into the story.
Oh, sure. So I had always heard about D&D, and I was never invited to play. I just didn't have people around me who played it. And then I met my husband, like on our first date, he was like, I'm a dungeon master. And I was like, I know what
Yeah.
that means. I want to know more. And I know that might have been a turn off for some women, but for me, I was like, I think we're going to be best friends. And it turned out great. And he's actually done it professionally for a little brief
Nice.
time. So it's really nice to connect over that because, I sit and I write stories. It's a very solo experience. And
Mhm.
he does it with a group of friends. And it's very similar, but very different at the same time. And then Gregor I wasn't, it was very overwhelming, all the different classes and races. And he was like, I'll take care of it. Just like describe a character
Mhm.
to me. And I procrastinated it. And I was actually a professional baker. I had a French macaron business. And
Wow.
that's another story. But I was baking for the next day because I had a farmer's market to be at. And my husband barged in and was like, you need a character. We have game tomorrow. Like, who's your character? And I was like, I don't know. Like, he's just pick something. And I was like, I don't know. Like, I'm short. It's like a dwarf. He's like, okay, what does he do? Like, he bakes. Thinking he'd leave.
Yep.
And he's like, well, what is he wearing? And I don't know. Around. I was like, I don't know. He like has a colander on his head, and he has a muffin tin as chest plate, and he uses baking twine for that, and he has a meat cleaver and a rolling pin. And my husband went, okay, so his stealth is zero because he's just clinking and
Yeah.
clanking wherever he goes.
Like a draw.
It's like based on that, he was like, I'll fill out the character sheet for you. Just think about Gregor. And then I kept thinking about him.
Mm.
And, whenever we played, I'd play a little bit of him. And then, we would just have downtime. And he'd like, well, what would Gregor do in this situation? And then I just
Mhm.
kept writing it. And it just turned into this kooky, fun little world that I wrote for myself that my husband kept asking about. And then I was like, well, maybe other people would enjoy this too.
Mhm.
I love that so much. D&D's been a huge part of my life. I'm a dungeon master as well, though my wife is less enthused about it than you are about your husband. I've only got her to play once, but I love one of my books is straight out of the world that we play D&D in, and I know that this is set in Everdorn.
Yes.
So is Everdorn the setting that you guys play in, or is that a setting of your own creation?
No, Everendorn's it's my world, but there's another
Yeah.
world that we were in. It was the Kingdom of Reese, and that's another kingdom on this continent in this world.
Mhm.
And it's nice because that one, it's not as cozy of a world. It's a
Yeah.
little more stressful because I had to, because we can't have a baking campaign. We have to do someone has to die. We have to dragons you. And I was like, all right. So then I didn't want to do it in Everdorn. I was like, let's do an adjacent kingdom then.
Would
I
it?
did think that when I was reading it. I thought if this was a D&D setting, it would be difficult to have a classic D&D campaign in such a comfy kind of like, well, all the sharp edges are kind of rounded off a little bit in this setting. And it works so well for the story. But I was like, I can't imagine like playing a barbarian in this setting who wants to avenge his family or something. Like it just doesn't have that tone. So no, that's really interesting. A little corner of the setting. That's
What
perfect.
wanting a follow up from that, as someone who doesn't play D&D, I have an understanding of how it works. Were there scenes?
I'll run a game for you, man. I'll
Well,
run a
I'll
game
play
for you.
I'd
virtually. Let's do
appreciate
it.
that. It'd be good to have like a YPQ D&D.
Yeah,
But
man.
were there scenes in the story itself where you didn't know what direction you were gonna go in, so you rolled dice to see what would happen?
No, I didn't. That's really clever. um, no, I should have done that. I should have done that.
I've done I've
It
done
turned
that
out
with
amazing regardless.
yeah. I've done that with action scenes where I'll plot it out like a Dungeons and Dragons fight so that I have a clear flow of kind of cause and effect and what happens, but it's more for constructing the scene.
Mm.
I
But
did.
the other, yeah, on you go, sorry.
I was gonna say I did think of. I was really big into like the choose your own adventure books when I was younger,
Yeah, yeah,
and pick this or that. And I was like, how fun would it be if you like the book came with a dice and you had to roll, and if it was like,
mm,
oh, if it's odd or even, or if it's above or below, that's
yeah.
the path you chose. I was like, maybe someday. So
That's
I
pretty
did
cool.
anticipate it.
That's we've had it was L.A. Gutler came out with
Yeah.
Choose Your Own Adventure story. They're really clever, and it feels like I imagine it takes a lot to build one, but then to
Mhm.
have the kind of the randomness of throwing a dice in there, that's really clever. I like that.
Maybe someday.
I think
It's on the list.
we'll shelf that for now because the other big thing that I really wanted to talk about, so obviously, and I'm a huge fan of it myself, is the Bake Off
Yeah.
that serves as the kind of structure for everything. So you're a baker yourself. Do you watch the Bake Off? How much of it went into like I know parts of it obviously have to like we'll get into that, but tell me about the Bake Off influence.
So I didn't watch any Bake Off before I wrote it, which is crazy. But I
Oh,
did.
We're American.
But I did watch a lot of Gordon Ramsay.
yeah, yeah, fair enough. Yeah, very different vibe.
He was inspiration for Professor Eklund in the beginning. He was really mean.
Oh,
So I was like really mean, and then my husband was like, "Oh, like everyone kind of bakes, but like you have this unique insight of like the chemistry and the science of it because you tested recipes specifically and you know what temperature does, what different ingredients do." And the nice thing about fantasy world is if I like in the baking contest, I was like, I don't know, let's just put a magic bean in there. So you can kind of in this world, you can like it helps you fill some of the gaps. Like I'm not really that much. I'm not as crazy into the science as some people are, but I've known enough that I could do it. And so I think, and spoiler alert, every round gets harder and harder because they discover that the princess can't eat certain things.
mhm.
And
Yep.
so that was another thing because like I make French macarons and they're gluten free. And so that was something nice that a lot of customers were like, oh, like I can't have it. I can't have gluten. I was like, say less, you have to buy it now
Yep.
because it's gluten free. And then
You're trapped.
then I was like, maybe I'll make vegan ones. And I looked at some really weird recipes. And I was like, this is not worth it. But it's one of the fun things of like how like it's not just make a perfect cake, make something really hard. And I wanted to go with that.
Well, and I think we speak on this a lot in terms of accessibility of stories, and specifically from like the sci-fi end and also the fantasy end when it comes to world building and this and that. Sometimes authors can make it hard for stories to be accessible because there's so much to introduce, and from that, like even the baking and the science behind it was so easy to follow. And it just felt so gentle. And like you said, like, oh, just throw a magic bean in there. We'll be fine. Like reminding ourselves that this is a story and it can go in whatever direction we want. But I did love the kind of puzzle aspect of it, of like what the princess can eat, what the princess can't eat. Because there were definitely
Mhm.
moments where I was sitting there like basically jotting down like, okay, this is good, this isn't good. How are they gonna go about this? How and I think what stood out to me the most was you had a few characters, but the majority of the characters were on the same team. Even if they knew only one of them would win, they weren't fighting each other, which I thought was a really nice kind of, it was just kind of a nice feeling because I feel like today everything is so competitive.
Originally it was going to be not quite Hogwarts, but it was going to be a magical school, and the final competition was going to be their final exam. But then I was
Mhm.
like, I don't want it to be YA. I want it because we can kind of guess how old Gregor is. We kind of know that Noel's younger in human years,
Mhm.
but we don't know what the ages of some of these characters are. And I was like, that's for me, that's really important because you don't have to be a certain age to be a baker. Anyone can start baking at any time of their life, and so I wanted to make that more accessible. And then, you have these characters that I was like, they went to school together, so they do have this camaraderie and this fierce competition. But like they've been together for so many years. Even the character that they least like, the arrogant bard, they're like, he's one of us. He makes baking cool. Like, he's at the end of the day, like they know that after all of this, they're going to go into the world and they're going to be, fellow bakers, and they're going to have to rely on each other in the real world. And that was very realistic for me. And I wanted to keep that in the story.
Mhm.
Mhm. It was such a rich cast of characters. I wanted to ask how you came up with them, if there was any inspiration from your game or anything, or from telly or whatever research that you've done, because the cast was usually a big cast kind of puts me off a little bit, but the
Mhm.
way that they kind of came in and out of it, almost like episodically, I think worked so well to its advantage. Was that deliberate?
It what I don't know. They just organically happened. I think the first I started with Gregor and Noel's friendship, and I was like, I want Gregor is a dwarf who is new to this very mixed city, but it's mostly humans, and so he makes a human friend. Um, and then, but Noel's very very friendly, and so he has another best friend, and that kind of causes some tension, and the jealousy of like, well, who's your best friend? Like, and then that happens, and then I did get some D&D inspiration. I was like, I want something kind of random, like and like, why would someone go be a baker? And so then Brimley came in, and he was like, well, he wants to serve the poor, and he wants to make sure that everyone gets to enjoy baked goods because it's not reserved just for the wealthiest. And so, and then I don't know, I just started getting goofy with it. And he works at this crazy monastery, and they bought him for a wheel of cheese when he was very young. And it was just like, well, how would that person feel? It just kept going there. And then I kind of needed tension in this friend group, right? So I had to get someone who's only there because he wants to prove his dad wrong. And then we get Ellis. And I was
Mhm.
like, he's just going to be, Prince Charming had to pick a profession to, upset his father. Who would that be? And I was like, it's Ellis. Like, he's this
Mhm.
jock. He's beautiful. Everything's effortless for him, and yet he finds himself having to kind of compete more than he wanted to, and something that he thought was going to
Mhm.
be, oh, I'll be at the top of my class. All of a sudden he's like, well, there's some pretty good bakers here. And so that's where his tension kind of comes from. And I wanted to make sure that it was diverse enough that everyone knew who each individual character was, because I feel like
Mhm.
sometimes you read a cast, they all kind of start to blur together, or their names start to sound the
Yeah.
same. I was like, I need distinct characters
Mhm.
and motivation enough for each of them that anyone can root for whoever they want as they're reading it.
And
Yeah.
I agree because it felt like even though there were a fair few amount of characters, they all had their own things and they all felt very humanized. Like even Ellis, you have the whole arm wrestling like kind of subplot that's going on in the background there. Like they each had their own kind of humanizing features and humanizing aspects to their lives, which I think made it a lot easier because I'm someone who the moment there's like four characters, I'm like, oh, okay, I'm gonna need a plot line and everything because I don't have the world's best. it is what it is. But basically, having them be so distinct made it really easy to follow. So I do appreciate that. And I think readers do as well.
And while we're touching on characters, slate aside, I have to ask about the pigeons.
Oh man, when the pigeon thing dropped at the end, I was like, that makes so much sense.
I don't know where it came from. I don't know. I have to also preface that this book was written for fun during maternity leave, and so I was having
Oh, amazing. Yeah.
everything was like it was an escapism, and then it was just so I love Terry Pratchett, and I love that
Did we talk? Did we say the Terry Pratchett word? I wrote on my notes Pratchett question mark because I'm a huge Terry Pratchett fan, and I kept thinking about Terry Pratchett when I was reading this. Keep going. Sorry.
No, good. I'm glad you picked up on it. As far as fantasy goes, I've read lots of fantasy, and I love him and his characters, and I like the world where it's like you can pick up any book at any time, and you know enough about them, and
Mhm.
they're goofy and it's so ridiculous, but you can believe it. And so I
Yeah.
was like, well, there's this whole, how do we get mail in this world? You start world building. You're like, well, they don't have telephones. I'm like, well, we got mirrors coming. But I was like, well, before that, like, how do they do it? And I think I like watched a YouTube video on pigeons, and I was like, pigeons don't get enough credit. We're gonna put pigeons in this world. And then it just kept getting goofier because I think when I first wrote this in the first draft, it was a drunk pigeon that delivered the wrong acceptance letter to Gregor, and I think he
Yeah.
couldn't read, and so he didn't know it wasn't for him. And so he went, and I was like, wow. So I had to adjust it a bit. But it started with a drunk pigeon shows up with a letter for a dwarf to go to pastry school. And then the story just went off from there. And I was like, well, how does a pigeon get drunk? I mean, times drinks. I was like, but like, we've got shapeshifters in this world. Well, spoiler alert.
Mhm.
And I love that at the very end where it matters the most, they're like, Gregor, how did you not know? Well, it makes sense because, if you're an immigrant to a land, there are some things that are just so commonplace, like no one would think to tell you that. Um,
Mhm.
and my parents are immigrants, and so like hearing their stories of like, yeah, we had to like figure things out, like oil changes. No one told us you had to like
Mhm.
change your car's oil, and people just know that. And I was like, yeah, like that totally makes sense. If you come to something that's so commonplace, everyone knows that there's. How do you not know that they're shapeshifters? Everyone knows that. It's so obvious. We don't have to mention it. And why didn't you ask? He's like, well, how would I have thought to ask?
Because I had no clue. I was trying to piece two and two together until like the bomb dropped, for lack of a better word. And I was like, oh, that makes so much sense. And I think that's a really good sentiment to hold there, is that not everyone has the same kind of baseline as everyone else.
Mhm.
Hmm.
The allusions to Terry Pratchett that we were mentioning there are important because Terry Pratchett's one of the few authors that really makes me laugh out loud, and it's not often that that happens. And I got that with this book. There was bits that made me chuckle and stuff. There was a couple of good thigh slaps. I was like, it was good. A couple of wee, a little breath out the nose laughs. It was funny, but writing humor is so difficult if you do it kind of deliberately. And I feel like that Terry Pratchett vibe that I was getting was from where the humor comes from the tone, if that makes sense. So tell me a little bit about how you went into it writing humor, because I know it can be quite scary trying to be that kind of earnest and like funny and offhand in writing.
I think the biggest part was I was going into this thinking this is a goofy world. This is not supposed to be taken too seriously. And I'm kind of, I like to say I'm a kind of funny person. I like to find the humor in things. My husband and I make each other laugh. We come up with characters that make each other laugh on purpose. So I was like, just be yourself. If it's not funny, then like I got to enjoy writing it. And luckily
Mm-hmm.
it's shown through. I got notes back from my editor, and I had to like, okay, these are great, but like I had to like clear out the LOL. This is so funny. I laughed so much. Thank you. But like, what? I need more criticism.
Yep.
So it was nice when I got those back. I'm like, okay, like, and there was some like cheap little jokes in there. But yeah, and I think I was like, if you really lean into just how absurd this world is, then like
Mhm.
you're allowed to make it a little funny.
Branching off of the humor, this might have just been me, but with the pigeons and the mirrors, I definitely
Oh,
saw a bit of Shrek in here. And I want to know if that was just me or if that, because like it's that modern day blend of medieval times that really caught me throughout.
I didn't think of Shrek, but yeah, this kind of like, you know, enough modern things in it that it's easy to keep track of things.
Mhm.
It's easy to relate to it. It makes it go by faster. And that's what I wanted. I wanted an easy read. And then, like I was like, well, what about the pigeons? And do they want to deliver mail? And I was like, you know what? I'm going too deep. I am the ethics of pigeon delivery is not for this book. That's a different book.
That's the
Just
sequel.
and that was the thing though too is I was like, well, what is this book like? It's like Terry Pratchett, and he writes about some heavy stuff in a
hmm
satirical light way. And I have to mention, I did read Legends and Lattes, and
hmm
that gave me permission to be like, you don't have to go too deep into the lore,
Yeah.
and you can make it relatable and lighter as you write this.
There was a note that I made, and I'm assuming that as a D&D player, you know what kitchen sink fantasy means.
Kitchen sink fantasy, yeah.
Yeah, so I wrote kitchen sink at one point in my notes because, like you were talking about earlier, when you were coming up with the pigeons and everything, and how the world works, you're like, well, I have a problem in terms of world building, and the great thing about a kitchen sink fantasy setting is not only that you can just tip out the box and see what's there and pick whatever thing you like, like shapeshifters, brilliant, let's go for it, but that you can use these things, and because it's part of general fantasy, like anyone who's played D&D knows what an orc is, that kind of thing, people recognize it immediately, so you don't really need to bother explaining it. There's dwarves, there's dragons, there's magic and stuff. Like if something like truth serum comes up, everyone's like, yeah, we know what truth serum is. You don't need to justify it with 10 pages of lore
Mhm.
and stuff. It's just like, yeah, we know, we get it, we get what truth serum is. I think that played to the advantage a lot in this story, where it's a familiar setting, even though it's a new setting. It's got all those kind of hallmarks that people pick up easily. Did you find that yourself when you were writing it?
It did, and I realized after the fact, I was like, I didn't really describe the dragons. But when I talked to my cover artist, I was like, imagine if a dragon was like a fat, lazy, naughty cat, and he was like, okay. And I think he understood the assignment when he wrote it. So I kind of the inspiration for like the domesticated kitchen dragons came from a cat that I
Uh-huh.
had that was very naughty. But that's the thing is like you can imagine what a dragon looks like and like a big dragon looks like. And I had the cover art and I had the first insert page with a dragon on it, and I was like, we all know what
hmm
dragons look like. That makes
Yep.
it easy, but it also makes it hard because there were some points like I was describing the magic putty, and like, what all can you do with this? And I was like what? Like I didn't have an answer for some things throughout the book, and I was like, well, I am the god of this book. No one else knows
Yep.
the answers. I have to decide. I have to make this change. Do I want it to do this or that? And I was like, this one. I should have rolled a dice sometimes. That would have been helpful.
It's funny that you went to cat for dragon, like small dragon behavior, because there was a book released a while back. I
It
can't
looks like
remember
it
what
though.
source book it was.
Or
Oh,
yes.
look at them! Yeah, I've got them here as well. They're beautiful. But there was a source book released a while back, like a monster manual type book with D&D creatures to use, and in it was Tome of Beasts, I think, and it was an alehouse dragon, which is just little dragons that live in alehouses and get drunk, and they're quite cantankerous and stuff. And the minute I described this to my players, they were like, "Where can we buy one? We want one." So then
It's
I
a,
had to. It became a mainstay, and then I had to figure out how a small dragon would act, and I just went cat. My wife's cat. I went, right, it's a cat. It's basically a cat. So sliding things off tables whenever it gets the opportunity.
and
Just
that's
mischief.
because it's definitely not a dog. I don't know how to explain it,
Nah.
but it's definitely not a dog.
Yeah,
Well, I think
I
it
don't. I,
also
I know exactly what you mean. Dragons don't have dog energy. They've definitely got cat energy though. Something a bit mischievous, especially the small ones.
well,
So on you go, Ryan.
I was just gonna say, and I think like that's kind of the beauty of it is it is this fantasy world where obviously you're the one in charge, but at the same time, it does give the readers a lot of opportunity to kind of have their own perspectives and their own positions on this. Like when it comes to the dragon, you see there and the dragons just hang out and they're meant to be, there's moments where like they're guard dogs, but they're pretty much useless at that. And they're just there to like light the fire and eat sweets. It's like, oh, well, that's fantastic. And
Even
I
that's
very
something.
much I got cat energy from them, but I also saw a bit of dog just because it was that same kind of trope of like bribing the dog with a steak so that you can get past without him waking anyone up. It was like bribing a dog with, I think in this instance was a cake or some sugar or something, and be able to circumnavigate that, which I thought was quite fun.
There's and it mentions it in the book. There's some work dragons that are used for like blacksmith and glass
Yeah.
blowing. But I feel like that the palace ones specifically are very spoiled, and so there's definitely some that are used. I feel like herding and stuff.
Hmm.
But that was kind of on the in the in the peripherals of the story, and I feel like the ones that I had I was like, well, these are pampered palace
Yeah.
dragons that are just they've gotten too comfortable.
Yeah, dragon equivalent of a house, like a spoiled house cat.
Or
No,
like
I
a
got that from
chihuahua,
them.
they're not really yours
Yeah,
either.
yeah, carry them about in a bag, you know.
Yeah, the handbag dog too.
So there was one thing that I wanted to ask you because I'm aware that we're getting close to the kind of time limit here. But when you got to the point where Celeste announces the winner and kind of like looks at Gregor and says, "So, were you tempted at all to leave like 8 pages of just blank space for that dramatic pause that they do in every competition?"
I wanted, or like Fade to Black, like two black pages. Like I have to get to it. It was hard to build it, but it was also like, well, we start out with Gregor, so I think we know who wins.
Yeah,
Like
that's fair. That's totally fair.
it was a little spoiled to begin with.
Well, and I wanted to get into forgive me, I read this book a minute ago and I'm forgetting the name of it, but like, because Gregor's dad is in charge and he did the ceremony and he got the egg. And I thought that whole kind of dimension in the background with Gregor trying to figure out and navigate between his parents and what he felt was his destiny versus where he actually found himself trending towards I think just further emphasizes the relatability of this book. Like, how many times have we all done something where your parents are like, "You sure about that?" Um,
Selling French macarons, like
Yeah.
it just kind of happened, and I kind of liked that. Like I got into baking because it started as a COVID hobby, and then they got too good, and then I kept selling them, and then I was at a bunch of farmers market, and I was like, this is getting out of hand, and so I kind of liked that. I channeled that into Gregor of like, I just accidentally tried some sugar, and this is the best thing ever, and everyone should enjoy this, and why shouldn't they? And like, I'm here, I am, and then slowly the guilt comes in of like, oh no, it's been 2, 3 years and now I'm here and like I'm about to graduate and I have to face my parents and be like, this is it. And
I see.
I liked that motivation for him.
Mhm.
Um, because he's a dwarf. Like they have to have, again, D&D, they have to have these like
Yep.
glorious
Like
motiv-
we all have our interpretation of what a dwarf is and what an elf is and this and that. And you can thank probably Lord of the Rings for that, but there is the interpretation of what they're meant to be. And so at the end of the day, this is a story. They can be whatever you want. Like, and I think that
And there's
that's
a lesson in that. There's a lesson in that.
there has to be.
A moral to the story.
I'm not articulate enough to articulate it, but there is one there. Um, and I think it just comes back to the whole wholesomeness of it and kind of the point of the story as a reader was it really felt like a hug the entire way through, which was quite nice. Because like even when it's building up to when he's gonna tell his parents, at no point as the reader you're like, oh, his parents are gonna be pissed about this. You know, like it's pretty much gentle through and through, which I think, especially given how the world seems to be, is a very nice thing to have.
Yeah, I missed fairy tales where even when the dragon came, even when the bad guy, kidnaps the princess, at the end of the day they're gonna live happily ever after. They're gonna ride off into the sunset. And
Mhm.
I feel like we kind of I don't know, maybe it was Game of Thrones that was like, actually, let's kill every character you love. And I was like, ah. And I feel like maybe at least for me, that's when it was starting to get like, this is getting a little scary. I don't know how it's going to end. And I just
Mhm.
sometimes, I just want to read a book where I'm like, it's going to be okay at the end of it. And so that's what I wanted when I was writing it. I mean, I still love reading scary books and wild romances, but I think as something is so immersive as actually writing it yourself, I want to be okay at the end of it.
Well,
Yeah.
and I think from our experience working with so many indie authors at this point, because they don't have to fit the more trad publishing mold, they can go off the deep end by the end of it. We've featured some stories where it's like, oh yep, that's gonna happen. Like they can break the mold. So there's a time and a place, and it was really nice that this continued with the theme of the book, for lack of a better word. I hate being that person. We have 4 minutes left, and I just want to make sure that we get all of our eggs in a basket, for lack of pun intended. Um, if people, and for those who liked Desserts and Dragons, where is the best way that they can get a hold of you? What would you suggest they read next?
um,
What do you, yeah, sorry, words.
Of yours.
of mine,
Yeah.
okay, so that's my debut book.
Okay.
But my
Oh,
next,
congratulations. I
thank
didn't
you.
think it was a debut. I can usually
Yeah,
tell.
Oh,
that's
well, thank you.
awesome.
I have my next book coming out this June.
Mhm.
It is part of the same world. We have a few side characters who make appearances. But
Amazing.
I have a website. It's bohuffman.com. And then you can sign up for my newsletter there. And
Mhm.
then I'm most active on Instagram.
Mhm.
And so you'll find I have like an author Facebook page that just automatically posts what I post on Instagram. But if you want up to date news, either of those two are the perfect
Mhm.
places.
Perfect. Sorry,
We'll get all those links and stuff posted below. Do I have time, Ryan, for one single was it deliberate from my notes that we haven't touched on?
please.
Okay, it just says the mirrors, it's TV, it's phones, it's allegory. Is that correct? Was that deliberate?
All of it, yes,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Obsessed with TikTok, and the
Yep.
funny part about it is, it's like, oh, we're going to use this to spy on people. We're going to use this for communication. And if as you're reading it, like at the end, like what are the guards using it for? They're looking at brothels. Like, and it was like
Yeah.
that's what the internet's for. Like
I think
it's
I think I wrote this after the bit where they stay up all night watching it and stuff, and they're like, "God, this thing's poison! Like this is terrible. Like, we didn't stop using this." And I was
yeah,
like, "Yeah, yeah, I've been there."
it was
Yeah,
the
no.
stupid TikTok.
There's a lesson there somewhere. Um, one of the things I wanted to ask, because I absolutely loved the note that you made that featured with the story.
Mm,
I am
yeah,
not much of a baker myself. Is that if I go through and make that recipe, does that make the perfect mini vanilla cakes?
It does.
Oh, wonderful.
It
I've
does.
got to try it.
Because I went to a birthday party, my niece's birthday party, and I made those, and my sister had like generic ones, and no one ate hers, and they all ate mine. And
Yeah,
so I tried and tested. Yeah,
And I think
amazing.
it's little things like that that really accentuate the story because they like you said, like you did this start as a D&D thing. You're a baker, and it feels like there's a lot of you in the story as well. And I think it reads as an authentic tale.
The love shines through.
that's so good to hear. Thank you.
But so the next one comes out in June, and I guess because we got a minute left, and I would always love using the time. What is your favorite pastry?
My favorite pastry is a
Mhm.
chocolate croissant.
Oh yes,
That I won't even try to make it. It was French macarons. I got sick of them. But it is a perfect buttery, flaky chocolate croissant. I want it, and then the one that crumbles all over you as you're eating it.
Mhm.
That's the
Is
one.
this
yeah.
like a chocolate croissant or like a pain au chocolat kind of thing?
It's a pain chocolat, but I'm in
Okay,
Texas.
okay,
Call
yeah,
it
yeah,
that
yeah.
here.
Always,
It's
always
the almond croissants for me, man. I'm also really nervous about saying croissant live on a video that's going on YouTube because it
croissant.
doesn't come out well in Scottish, you know.
I'm such a fiend for chocolate and sugar, but I don't have a favorite. Right now, my kick has been Rice Krispie treats, and I just adore them.
What about you, Steve?
You have 10
Almond
seconds.
croissant.
What's
Plus
up?
Salmon
one.
quackling. And we'll leave it on that one.
On that
It's been a
note,
pleasure,
thank you
Bo.
so much for joining us, Bo. If you made it this far, the book was Desserts and Dragons. Stay tuned for more, and thank you again. Have a great day, guys.
Thank you so much. Bye bye.
Cheerio, guys. Bye bye.
Give me a sec.